Hey guys, this is Rick. I figured the Bitcoin community, both the BTC and the BCH forks of Bitcoin, have a lot to learn from the early days of the internet, when it was nowhere sure that the internet would be the standard. Because there are many, many lessons that we can learn from that. And they're not that very intuitive. Let's take a look. So this is going to be a slightly technical presentation, but the point of the technical details is to illustrate that in the end, it's not the technical details that really determine success. This might sound counterintuitive. So let's take a look at it. I'm going to focus on the International Standardization Organization's OSI model, network model, X25 as sold by the big telecoms, and something called SAR, segmentation and reassembly. And also a little bit of Apple's early marketing and how that was key to this. We'll see how this applies to the internet and, by extension, to Bitcoin and the Bitcoin communities. There is an excellent book on project management that opens ominously with these famous words. Somewhere today, a project is failing. It is the book Peopleware. If you haven't read it, it's an absolute recommend. And the book describes scientifically, not wishy-washy, but these are hard data points, that most projects fail for social reasons. They are not technically complex. We are not doing basic research. This is not quantum physics. Most projects are something like implementing an auditing system for this accounting project. This is not rocket science. We know how to do this, and still the projects fail. And they fail for social reasons. This is important to realize, because this means that once your developers are adequate, then other factors become more important for your project's success. Whether you have the best developers is completely irrelevant. And to illustrate here, I'd like to go back to the early 70s and the digitalization of the telecoms industry. When we went from analog wires, having analog phone calls, when you could actually hear that you were talking to somebody on the other side of the planet and were literally screaming into the wires so they would hear something. This was fact. I experienced this. I am old. So in the early 70s, the telecoms industry started digitizing your phone calls. So your stream of voice would become a chopped up stream of packets. It would digitize this second to this big a packet and then fit many more packets onto a single line. This technique was called SAR, segmentation and reassembly. And the idea, of course, was that the packets could be sent individually over wires and routed through the correct destination, thereby creating what we know as a packet-switched network. This contrasts with the earlier network where you had a direct physical galvanic connection to the recipient's handphone set, which was a circuit-switched network. You had a circuit all the way to somebody listening. As in, there was actually a voltage being transmitted all the way, and in an analog connection. The purpose of going to packet switching was, of course, that you could have something called dynamic multiplexing. Multiplexing was a technology that the telecoms industry had been using for quite a while, and it simply means that you have 16 phone calls going on over one physical wire. When you can chop them up digitally, you can stack them in time instead of on top of each other in different frequencies. And so, depending on how much people talk, you can fit more or less into the same line at the same time, dynamic multiplexing. And this led to a lot of committees designing new standards for the world's packet-switched network. Something called the International Standardization Organization was brought in. And all these very big incumbents, IBM in particular, and all the big telecoms, started designing something known as the OSI layer stack, the network layer stack. It looked something like this. We're talking about 7 layers, numbered pedagogically 7 to 1. The physical layer, which is the wire, data link, which is a little bit of information about the wire, network, transport, session, presentation, and application. The idea was that you would have a corresponding stack on the receiving side, and a signal would go from an application, or rather from a user through an application, through the presentation layer, which handles character set encoding and so on, to a session layer, which handles the connection, to transport, which guarantees delivery, to the network, which has a network address, to the data link, which is the physical network card, to the physical connection, which is the wire between network cards, to the recipient, and all the way back up to the user on the other end. This was the idea. And this was the network model that was being taught in the 80s. This was being sold not as a design, but the design. There are no other network designs if you lived in the 80s. This is why we're still seeing terms like layer 3 switches. It comes from this, but it's no longer applicable, not at all. Not any more than color blue switches or triangle switches. It does not apply, because as we know, this standard didn't become the standard. Instead, we got something that kind of looks like this, and which is called the internet. OSI was developed slowly by incumbents who thought they could take forever, and as they were working, something else emerged under their radar. It was something called internet addressing. On top of the internet addressing was built something called TCP/IP, which guaranteed delivery, and then everything on top of that was just application specific. Everything below the internet was network specific. If you want to be really picky, you can argue that you can divide the network into layers 2 and 1 by looking at the MAC address and the LLC phase here and the physical wire, but that depends on your point of view. And you know, these OSI layers, they don't even map to the internet as we know it. Talking about network layers today is as obsolete as talking about steam engines powered by coal, because it just doesn't apply to anything modern. Let me give you an example. If we're looking at the dividing section here, the interface section between layers 4 and 5 in the OSI model, most sketches of the internet as though it was mapping onto the OSI model draw the same line between TCP/IP and whatever comes on top, like HTTP. But this isn't true. This isn't true. Remember now, layer 4 guarantees transport. It guarantees segmentation and reassembly at the other end. The session layer is what guarantees a persistent connection between 2 endpoints. And this part is quite in TCP, in the internet standard. So we have a very big part of TCP that's actually mapping to the session layer in OSI. In particular, the graceful termination with the fin-ACK sequence, But even on a philosophical level, the persistent connection definitely belongs in the session layer in the OSI model. So these OSI layers don't even apply anymore. Talking about layer 3 switches, layer 4 switches is as obsolete as if you were talking about a coal-powered Tesla, basically. We can observe also that the ISO OSI came from the telecom world, so they were completely focused on the session layer because their thinking was circuit-centric. Their thinking came from the old telecom world, where you were charging by the second for a circuit. In contrast, TCP/IP was packet-centric. It was down here at layer 3 instead of layer 5. So when the big telecoms were rolling out their X25 services in the early 90s, this was an incredibly expensive data service that was packet switched and which was basically only available to a few select business cases because it was expensive, it was complicated, and nobody used it. This was around 1990. And at this time, it was the second-tier telecoms that were rolling out TCP/IP. Taking Sweden as one example, the national monopoly, dominant Telia, didn't do TCP/IP at all. It was something called Tele2 that rolled out what was then known as SWIPnet, the Swedish IP network. And I'm taking Sweden as an example here for two reasons. First, I come from Sweden, so I'm very familiar with its history. And second, it's kind of a forerunner in terms of household bandwidth, currently rolling out 10,000 megabit per second connections, 10 gigabit connections to ordinary households, which is roughly 2 orders of magnitude above most other places on the planet. So it's an interesting case study to look at. And it was the second-tier telecoms that rolled this out, along with guerrilla technology in the first-tier telecoms. You could hear people saying that if you're using a TCP/IP stack in my department, you're going to get fired. Not entirely unlike how Warren Buffett today is saying that if I catch you trading Bitcoin, you're going to be fired. Guerrilla technology. Obviously, the guerrilla technology won out here, as we know from history. But it wasn't a foregone conclusion that this would happen. It wasn't a foregone conclusion. So from these protocol wars, these standardization wars between the ISO OSI on one hand and TCP/IP on the other, we learn a number of lessons. And these are important. First, the market's idea of the best technology may be different from yours. It is quite probably predicated on social factors and cost factors rather than what is the best technology. It'll be predicated on what people can use as guerrilla technology rather than what is permissioned and what you have to wait for. The market will choose one solution. It will move ahead, as it would move ahead from circuit switched to packet switched. And if you're not providing a solution that works, then the market's choice will not be your solution. Wait for us is always, without exception, a losing proposition. If you're saying wait for us, you are already losing. The BTC fork of Bitcoin does this. Wait for the world's best developers. Incumbents, we learn, work slow but steady. And they know how to get something useful out into the hands of the mass market. And in face of disruption, the incumbents have far, far more resources to work quickly to eliminate any threat on all platforms they can, innovation, legal, and staff-wise. They are going after disruption any way they can. And so, in the end, the winning technology is far more a matter of social and cost issues than it is tech alone. So how does this apply to Bitcoin? Well, as we see, the market waits for no one. As the BTC fork of Bitcoin says, wait for us while the best developers do their work. That's a double fault. Because wait for us is a losing proposition, and the best developers doesn't matter. They do not matter. We know that banks are working slow but steady round the clock on what people see as peer-to-peer financing. We have systems like Venmo, Swish, Vips, and so on, where people are using their phones to send some cents to each other completely free of charge. Completely free of charge, not cheap, free. And even though the guerrilla advantage here lies with Bitcoin, this is a race to the mass market. This is a land grab, right here, right now. And just because you have the guerrilla advantage, that doesn't mean you're going to win. Because Bitcoin needs to fix its social usability and market issues, or be overrun by the incumbents here. Just as TCP/IP was threatened to be overrun. And it was quite narrow that TCP won out. Don't take this lightly. Do not take this lightly. And this solution that the market chooses in the end, as long as the BTC fork of Bitcoin says that wait for us while the best developers do their work, it's not going to come from the BTC fork of Bitcoin. Let's compare this to Apple's early networking, coming full circle here. A key insight early for Apple was that they're not designing the product for themselves. The developers was not designing the Apple computer for developers. They were not designing the Macintosh for themselves. They were designing it for other people. And this is how Apple took a 2-generation lead in terms of technology generations, because they realized that they were designing for somebody else. This thinking is completely absent from the BTC fork of Bitcoin, that the target users are not developers. They are not interested in tinkering with advanced technology. They merely want something simple enough that just works. This is what Apple did. This is what gave them 2 technology generations of lead over everybody else in the market. Incumbents understand this. Incumbents do understand this. The clock is ticking. And so which technology will the market choose? That's a social question, not a technical question. Somewhere today, a project is failing. And it is not failing for technical reasons. It is up to us to make sure that it's the bank's idea of peer-to-peer that is failing, and not the liberty movement. In the next video, we're going to take a closer look at IRC, segregated witness, and social ecosystems. This might seem to be unrelated topics, but they fit together very nicely in terms of designing for other people. And I want to go a little bit deeper into that.